So I'm 16 now, and my parents gave me an early birthday present and let me go to a hockey game. The Pittsburgh Penguins and Washington Capitals were facing off for Game 1 in Washington. I'm a Penguins fan, and it's not easy living in DC with a whole bunch of Caps fans. But it made me a Penguins fanatic because I am behind enemy lines, if you know what I'm saying. The community is terrible in DC, and this story I am telling will prove my point. All the times I have been in DC, there have been some sort of crime happening around the area I was in. Anyway, enough with the background. My mom dropped me off at the metro. That would drop me off to my dad at the Verizon Center. My mom, being overprotective as always, had a hard time letting me go alone. But it would be convenient because she had to watch my brothers, and my dad worked in DC anyway. She didn't take her eyes off me until I got on the metro, and then texted me until I lost service. Now, until I reached the first stop of many, it was really crowded, so I felt comfortable. But when we stopped, everyone got off, and the only ones left were me and this really suspicious-looking person sitting right in front of me. Yeah, I was scared shitless for some reason, and the things my mom told me before didn't make me feel better at all. The guy looked about 6'3", and I was only 5'5" or something. And I wasn't that strong either. I took off my earbuds and looked down at my phone, constantly turning off and on airplane mode, because that usually worked. I glanced up real quick, which was a huge mistake. The guy had a hoodie on. I could barely see his face, but it was pale, and I felt an evil presence. I looked down at my phone again, and as soon as I hit the power button, "You a Christian boy," he said. How did he know? It couldn't have been my cross necklace because that was behind my shirt. I couldn't tell if he or it was asking a question or stating a comment. So I said, "Well, yes, sir, I am." I have kind of a high voice, which sucked, but I tried to make it sound as low and manly as I could. The trembling in my voice didn't sell it, though. "What's the question, boy?" he responded with an angry tone. We stopped at the next stop. I really wanted to look to see if anyone was getting on. I ended up not looking because I thought it was smart, but no. No one ended up getting on. What are the odds? This has to be the scariest experience of my life. 3 more stops, I thought to myself, trying to think as optimistically as I could. But it didn't do anything at all. It wasn't the answer. The doors closed. Here we go again. Why didn't I get off, you ask? Well, I was basically in shock. I didn't want to move. In fact, I couldn't move. Something was holding me down. The metro began moving again. The whole ride to the next stop. All he did was stare at me with a furious look. Why did he care if I was Christian? I really didn't understand. My mind was just focused on the next stop. The door opened, and to my surprise, no one got on. Once again, this just didn't make sense. Today was a big day for DC. The Capitals and Penguins were rivals. I was expecting for at least one Caps fan to get on the metro. The man smiled and then started making noises and shaking his hands. That's when I finally realized I was sitting across from someone who was evil. He couldn't have been insane. He was insanely evil. That's when I figured out the answer. It was God. Sorry if being a Christian and including God in this story offends you. I silently prayed for a bit, and as I did, this guy got angrier and angrier. It just wasn't right. I wanted to stop in fear that he would hurt me, but prayer was the most dangerous weapon to me, especially at this time. The doors opened and he shot up. I thought he was leaving, but I was terribly wrong. He stomped right over me and stood over me. I almost had a heart attack and curled up in a ball, bracing for death, but he didn't hurt me. Obviously, no one got on again, which I knew because he was still standing over me, probably blaspheming and spitting all over me in the process. It just kept going. I reached the final stop I was to get off at. The doors opened, and I all of a sudden stood up because I felt strong and courageous. He was still standing there and talking to himself. I really didn't care. I just walked out into the open. Still nobody. But as soon as I walked up some stairs, it was like in front of me was the most people I had seen in my life. I struggled to find my dad, but that was the end of it. I tried to explain it to my dad, but all he said was, "Yeah, right, and let's go." Anyway, this will stay with me until the grave. And I'm so glad I grew up in a strong Christian family. But the message was not only stay strong in Christ, which is a really important one, but to always be scared. After all, it is what keeps us alive. A few months ago, I was working at a certain establishment known for its scantily clad servers. Part of the job was sitting with the customers, especially the men, and talking with them in the hopes that they would tip you better. I'm an anxious person anyway, so I was never very good at that part. But every now and then, I would meet someone with whom I felt enough at ease to really get a conversation going. I had already been working there a few months, so I knew some of the regulars, at least by sight. This one dude would sit at the bar with his douchebag badge of honor, read vape, and a non-alcoholic drink. I didn't really talk to the bar patrons as much, mostly because I knew I wouldn't get a tip, so I had never spoken to him. Considering this, I thought it was strange when one day he asked to sit in my section. I thought maybe he just thought I was cute and wanted a chance to talk. So I kind of just went with it. I knew something was off pretty much from the start. He told me that he felt like he had to protect me, that something or someone told him to look out for me. He told me his name, which was different than the one he gave to the bartenders, and that he worked for the government in some capacity. He also told me about his abuse at the hands of his father, and how his girlfriend had died of a drug overdose in his arms. I thought all of this was weird, but I gave him the benefit of the doubt, trying to be sympathetic to someone who maybe struggled with mental illness. The way he spoke was off, like he would mumble some things or start a thought and move on to another one in the middle of a story. Despite this, I thought he was an interesting guy, and we had some things in common, both English majors in college, similar musical tastes, etc. After that initial conversation, he would come sit in my section whenever he came in, abandoning his usual spot at the bar. I think I was just so relieved to finally have a regular customer that I overlooked the many red flags that presented themselves. For example, he somehow knew about my boyfriend's name and where he worked, even though I'm pretty certain I never gave him that information. He kept trying to get me to give him more information about myself. Once he sat in my section all night and gave me cash every time I told him a factoid. He told me that he could sense I was sad and that I felt alone and that no one cared. This set off some alarm in my brain, as it sounded like abuser speak to me, but I shrugged it off, figuring he couldn't hurt me when I was at work, with so many people around. As he was leaving, he told me that he had completed several missions that night, and only had one left. When I asked him what that was, he looked me right in the eye and said, "You?" At one point, he told me he used to be a college English professor in another state, and that he had been published. I was intrigued, so I asked him to bring me a copy of the article. He did, and I was able to get his full name from the copy. When I looked it up later, I found that he had been busted for a prostitution ring the year before, but was apparently out on bail. Or maybe he pleaded insanity or something. I wasn't about to ask him about it. Fast forward a month or so. I had left that job for unrelated reasons, but he would still text me occasionally. He once sent me a message using a girl's name, probably assuming I hadn't saved his number. So I decided to mess with him and sent him a gross about being on my period or something, hoping he would take the hint and leave me alone, which he did. One night, my roommate, who worked at the same place, called me several times and left a voicemail for me to call her ASAP. When I finally responded, she told me that he had asked to be seated in her section and talked about me angrily. He cited the message I had sent him, saying it was clear I didn't want to talk to him. She said he was visibly agitated and that he would sometimes appear to be talking to someone who wasn't there. I should mention here that I had told her about him before and mentioned that he seemed a little off, but she told me not to worry about it. He then proceeded to tell her the same things he told me, with more sinister stuff mixed in. She's a much fierier individual than I am, so after a bit, she got irritated with him and yelled at him that she couldn't understand what he was talking about, and that he should go. She had already told the manager twice that he was making her uncomfortable that evening, and the manager just brushed it off because this guy was a regular. This guy also asked her to approach another bar patron and ask him about purchasing a gun. I guess the guy owned a gun store or sold guns on the DL, because he had already asked and the guy told him to get lost. At that point, she was able to finally get the manager involved, since he was trying to obtain an illegal firearm on the premises. He was escorted out and told not to come back. He sent me a few more messages after that, one in which he accused me of being a witch because he had had a dream about me. I never responded and blocked his number, and I haven't heard anything since. I'm just glad I quit when I did. I don't want to think what could have happened if I had continued to talk to him. I come from a small town in southern Ontario, Canada. Every year my father and I try to take 2 weeks over the summer and rent a cabin up north. On the particular year this happened, I was about 17 years old and was working a full-time job in a factory. My father's job had delayed his vacation days posting, and I was still waiting for my time off to be approved. So he and I were getting dangerously close to the deadline of renting a cabin. We usually booked our cabins months in advance to ensure we got the best prices and the nicest locations with the most hiking trails and tourist attractions. This year, however, we basically had to rent a cabin on the hem of our pants. I finally got my vacation approval only 2 weeks before our holiday started. We lost hope after the 5th resort we called told us what we already knew we were going to hear. They were booked up for the summer, We stopped looking after the third day of racking up phone bills, making phone calls that ended in disappointment and anger. I had more than accepted that this would have to be the first year in 5 we had not taken a trip up north. I had no idea it would be our last, though. Surprisingly, my father called me on a Wednesday morning, telling me to pack my bags. We were due to be at a cabin in Bridgeview on Friday afternoon. Bridgeview, name has been changed, was a small town about 7 hours north of my hometown, and a mere hour and a half from Sault Ste. Marie, which was the farthest north we had ever traveled. I was excited. I packed my bags, loaded up my car, and made the hour-long trip to my father's residence, so we could load up the new and improved 2007 Ford Mustang Ragtop and make the journey together. The trip to Bridgeview was beautiful, but tiresome. Long open roads, straight as arrows, vast billowing fields of farmers' life work, and dark, rolling forests that seemed to suck up the sun so its shadows may consume it. When we finally entered the very small town of Bridgeview, we were in awe of just how little it truly was. A single convenience store gas station sold overpriced cleaning supplies and snacks. This is important later. The residents smiled but never waved, seemingly wary of newcomers. I guess I should describe the ad my father responded to. The ad on Kijiji listed a cute little cabin with an add-on bedroom surrounded by woods. It was described to be a couple feet away from the crystal clear waterfront and a clean and welcoming atmosphere. The individuals who posted the ad claimed the cabin was available all summer, and my dad, being the pessimist he was, decided it must be a hidden gem that no one else discovered. To the willing heart, the ad made the cabin look gorgeous. Young wooden paneling, a newly built wraparound deck, indoor plumbing and electricity, high-end leather couches in the living room area, and plush single and queen-size beds in the add-on and master bedroom. The kitchen had all the stained wooden cabinets with sparkling white appliances. The ad even advertised the fire stove, heated hot tub besides the cabin that was free to use for renters, and a canoe that was said to be in near mint condition, safety vests and paddles included. The GPS obviously didn't recognize such a rural address back then, and it took us an additional 45 minutes of driving in and around the town before we finally found the hidden road we were supposed to take to our destination. The winding road snaked downhill through a plethora of spruce and oak saplings, shadowed by their ancient wooden guardians. The decline became steep as my father gingerly rode the brakes. He had specifically asked the ad holding in his private message if the path to the cabin was paved, as we did not have a vehicle that could handle any terrain other than flat. He assured us the drive was paved the entire way, and although the hill was steep and winding, it was relatively easy to navigate once she'd done it a few times. Granted, we were staying for 2 weeks. We'd figure between the two of us we would be able to get the car from point A to point B. To my father's dismay, the road's maintenance began to falter, until the once smooth asphalt had turned to a deep, loose gravel. My dad slowed the car to a near stop, then decided against it. He didn't want to get stuck and have to push the red beast out of the gravel that pulled at the tires like quicksand. We continued on our way. After about 5 minutes of slow cruising and the occasional curse muttered by my father, we arrived to a small clearing. The road we were on leveled out and turned to dirt before immediately careening down a steep incline into the water. A not so convenient place for a boat dock. Two young gentlemen with unwashed hair and bloodshot eyes greeted us at the cabin. They looked jittery, like they were resisting the urge to scratch a million mosquito bites all over their bodies. Their eyes drifted back and forth between my father and me before, quickly, snapping to the shiny Mustang sitting in the driveway. One of the men smiled as he nodded in its direction. "Nice car," he said through yellow teeth. My father politely nodded. "Thank you. Hey, didn't you see this road was paved all the way down?" The man looked confused, still not taking his eyes off the car. He was still smiling, the smile now turning into more of a grimace, as he forced to keep it on his worn face. "Did I say that? Sorry, guy. Must have slipped my mind. I've got a truck, you see. So used to coming down here. You have the money?" My father found it a little odd that the cabin was to be paid in cash only. They wouldn't even accept a deposit check. Now that he saw the two men were probably in their mid to late 20s, he knew why. It was party money. My father nodded and gave the man a wad of bills. The second man, a little shorter with a protruding beer belly, an equivalent to that of a 6-month pregnancy, and a dirty white tank top with a grimy brownish red stain down the front, stared at the money with hungry eyes. The thinner man with the beard grabbed the money and turned on his heel to leave, before turning back with his finger pointing skyward, as if to state an ingenious hypothesis. "Oh yeah, before I forget, the previous renters lost the keys to the cabin. Said they were in the lake somewhere. It's quiet out here, no one around for miles. No one will bother you. If you feel like locking the door, you'll have to reach your hand in through the window besides the front door to unlock it when you come back. Look, we've removed the window panel here and pinned back the screen so you can get in, see?" He shoved the dirty hand into the window beside the cabin door and locked and unlocked the door by hand. My father and I exchanged worried glances before the two men bounded off to the truck, shouting something about having a safe trip as they ran past and sped off. In their haste, they sprayed gravel over the front deck of the cabin. We shrugged our shoulders, dismissing their overly juvenile minds, and headed towards the car to grab our few bags. We were told the cabin was fully furnished, and so we didn't bring much other than toiletries, clothes, and some personal items. Before we entered the cabin, we set our bags on the deck and did a 360-point inspection of the exterior. It was obvious to us that the pictures in the ad had been taken some years prior, when the cabin was well maintained and new. Now the bright yellow lumber walls were a dingy, dying grey color. The deck creaked with decay, and the supposed crystal clear lake a few feet away was a murky orange lake of muck, and it was about a 3-minute walk down from a cliff to get to the beach below. The nearly mint-condition kayak lay on its side on the shore. Red paint had peeled off in places, making it look like an odd rendition of camel fashion. Dents lined the sides and the bottom of the kayak, and we wondered if the damn thing would even stay afloat. We wandered around the side of the cabin to find the hot tub, filled with green algae-infested waters. A thick sludge had formed on the top of the water, thick enough for insects to crawl across it. So much for using the hot tub this summer. We finally gathered up the courage to enter the cabin. We took a breath, locked gazes briefly, and my father led the way. As soon as he opened the cabin door, we were hit with a gut-wrenching stink of body odor. The smell was so horrible and putrid that I had to step out of the cabin briefly to fill my lungs with breathable air. After a moment, whatever stink that was trapped within the cabin generally wafted out the door. We entered the cabin and opened all the windows for better air circulation. The entrance was actually the additional bedroom that was poorly constructed and attached to the original cabin. You opened the front door and you entered the room approximately 6 feet by 8 feet. Directly in the middle of the room was an old, ratted pull-out couch, one that pulls out into a bed, and an old desk lamp with a moth-eaten lampshade stood dangerously close to the edge of a worn antique table. Beyond the entrance was a living area that consisted of a small leather futon. That was basically a leather brick couch that unfolded into a leather brick bed. Another antique coffee table, a 32-inch flat-screen television with a broken screen, and a wood-burning furnace that was held in place with polyethylene foam. Yes, highly flammable foam. And as far as we could tell, that was the only heat source in the cabin, and it was still early summer. The nights were still cold. The kitchen was a disaster. Dirty dishes covered all space on the countertops. Rotting food was left in the fridge, and a couple bags of frozen lake-caught perch were shoved into the back of the freezer. The stove still had a loaf of garlic bread in it from the last use, and above the cupboards was a stack of dusty Playboy magazines. The bathroom was as dirty as you could imagine, and smelled strongly of urine and mold. The shower and toilet lacked any kind of drainage system, and any water used in either would simply drop through a hole in the ground to the beach below. The beach where the man told us we could swim and dock the kayak. Finally, we entered the master bedroom. This was definitely the source of the foul stench. A single double-sized bed stood in the far corner of the room. Its formerly white mattress was stripped of any sheets, and the mattress itself was heavily stained with deep red, brown, and yellow stains. The carpet had similar stains around the bed, and the smell coming from the mattress was absolutely sickening. We opened the 3 windows that were in the decently sized bedroom, and closed and locked the door. We never entered it again. Feeling absolutely cheated and disgusted, my father and I decided to come up with a game plan. We had already driven the 7 hours to get here, had already taken the time off work, and most importantly, had already paid for the 2 weeks in full, in cash. We were stuck here. We decided to take the car, very carefully, back into Bridgeview and stop at the convenience store to pick up some cleaning supplies. Bleach especially, so we could at least make the cabin livable. We ended up spending 5 times the amount we would have from a general store, and spent the remaining 6 hours of the day cleaning the cabin from floor to ceiling. When we were finished, it actually looked pretty nice. The bedroom was condemned, but the kitchen was clean, and the beds were made with fresh sheets that, luckily, we had decided to bring from home. On the first night, I decided to sleep on the pull-out couch, because it was more comfortable than the futon. My father didn't argue, as he was never one to pick silly fights. We fell asleep early after an exhausting day of scrubbing until our fingernails bled. Around 4 a.m. that morning, I woke up to the motion light outside turning on. I figured a small animal must have run across the deck, or maybe the wind had blown something around that was large enough to trip the sensor. After a minute, the light faded, and darkness enveloped me again. I was about to close my eyes when the light flickered on again. This time I was getting a little nervous. I lay in bed and pulled the covers over my head. I didn't want to turn the lights on. If someone was outside, they could easily see me through the windows. The light switched on and off 3 more times before the darkness stayed with me until the sun chased it away in the morning. I laughed at myself in the morning, thinking my mind had been playing tricks on me. When I finally got out of bed, my dad was sitting up on the futon. His eyes looked dark and red. He hadn't slept very well either, I realized. "Did you see the lights?" he asked me. It was so sudden I had to ask him to repeat himself. "The lights, the motion lights, did you see them come on last night?" I nodded my head nervously, wondering why he was bringing this up. He said nothing else, just stared at the broken television. I shrugged it off as him not having had his morning coffee, and went to the kitchen to brew some. Nothing significant happened that day. We spent the day exploring the woods and briefly testing out the kayak. It floated. We decided to put it to the real test tomorrow morning. That night, while my father and I were getting ready to go to bed, he brought my pillow and blanket from the pull-out couch and brought it to the futon. "Can you sleep here tonight?" he asked. "I'm too old to lay on cement. That futon killed my back last night." I nodded without hesitation and handed him his pillow and blanket in exchange for my own. I thought nothing of it for the next few nights. That night, around 1 a.m., I woke to the motion sensor light flicking on. I lay awake with my eyes wide open. I could just barely make out the illumination of the light through the blinds behind me. I heard a faint tapping sound coming from the kitchen area, and then again at the window behind my head. I froze and held my breath, listening. I heard nothing else. The light turned off after a moment, but I drifted back to sleep. At 3 a.m., I was awoken again. I thought I heard laughter coming from outside. I thought surely I had been dreaming, but as I turned my head, I realized that the motion light was, once again, rivaling against the moonlight. The light flicked off, and just as I was about to drift back to sleep, I heard it again. It definitely fucking laughing. Coming from the front deck, I stiffened in my blanket and strained my ears to listen to anything seemingly inaudible to the human ear. I heard it again, a distant laughing, and this time, footsteps. I heard slow and deliberate footsteps walking up the deck toward the front door. My initial reaction was fear, not for me, but for my father who was sleeping in the other room, a mere 2 or 3 feet away from the front door that someone, or something, was now standing at. I was paralyzed with fear, waiting to hear the sound of the screen being pushed aside, a bony hand reaching in through the mangled mesh, and then the soft click as the lock gave up its desperate hold on the door. I began to sob softly as I envisioned my father being attacked by a stranger at the door, never even knowing what was coming for him. I lay there and waited for what seemed like hours. Finally, the porch light turned off, and silence filled the gaps in the night. I didn't sleep a wink. The following day, I decided not to tell my father about what had happened. He had obviously slept through the entire event, and would surely think me mad if I had told him such a brother's grim tale. Instead, we spent the day exploring the last bit of the surrounding bush. What we found was unnerving. Tucked away, in behind two massive spruce trees, was a white and red rusted caravan. The doors hung open as if welcoming strangers into its death trap of shrouded metal and dust. The back window was smashed in with something heavy, a rock or a ball or a bat. As we drew nearer to the caravan, we concluded that it was obviously abandoned, and for quite some time. Tires lay flattened on bent aluminium rims, and greenery began to weave its way through the tarnished frame. Tucked into the center console, under what looked to be an abandoned squirrel nest, were 3 IDs. I recognized 2 of them immediately. They were the men who rented us the cabin. What were they doing out here? I would like to add, it took my father and I a good half hour to get to this location, and we bushwhacked the entire way. I was finding this was mere coincidence at best. Whoever put the vehicle there never intended for it to be found. We quickly threw the licenses onto the driver's seat and hurried back to the cabin. That night it rained. Hard. And we found out our cabin had multiple gaping holes in the roof, just behind the paneling, so dirty brown water seeped down the walls in torrents. The light remained off that night. The next 3 nights were also uneventful. On the following Friday, we decided to finally try out the kayak. It was a risk indeed, but one we were willing to take since we had already hiked around the cabin property multiple times. We decided we were going to cross the lake and tie off on the opposite shore and fish off the rocks that jutted out 15 feet from the shoreline. It took us a little over an hour to make it, and I noticed in the distance there was something hanging from a lonely tree, poking out at an awkward angle from a cliff face. We pulled the kayak on the shore and traveled the rocky shore to investigate. My heart dropped when we got close enough to see what it was. A dark, tattered noose hung from a broken tree branch, about 10 feet in the air. The noose swung loosely over an array of sharp rocks and debris from passing fishermen. My blood turned to ice in my veins as I looked back to my father. His eyes were wide, but he said nothing. He simply motioned us back to the kayak, and we returned to the cabin. We didn't speak the entire time. That night, the sounds on the deck were worse than before. I could distinctively hear a type of cackling in the distance, and the light turned on mere seconds after the timer plunged the deck back into darkness. This time, my dad could hear it too. I crept into his room to find him sitting upright in his bed, with the blankets pulled over his body to camouflage himself in the darkness. He was staring motionless at the door. I could see his shadow pass by the window as I walked back to my futon. I nearly pissed myself then and there. But my father and I have been through some terrifying experiences, and we can both handle our own. I wasn't going to panic unless he did, and now was not the time. I went back to bed and lay awake all night, listening to the constant tapping and laughing coming from the abyss beyond my windows. When morning came, my father and I finally passed out in our beds. We would spend the rest of our trip doing this, staying awake all night and sleeping all day. By Monday, we had had enough. We were ready to leave, take a loss, and give up our final few days at the cabin. We packed our bags and planned on leaving in the morning. That night it rained. Hard. So hard that it washed out the steep, winding road that led down the forest to the clearing. It had rained so hard, it had nearly caused erosion to drop the car backwards into the lake. We couldn't leave in the morning. We were stuck until the ground dried enough to attempt it with the car. We brought our bags back inside and awaited another terrifying night. That night was surprisingly quiet. The motion light remained off. The wind gently rustled the leaves on the branches above. And every once in a while you could hear a wave or two crash against the sandy shore. Around 2 a.m. the deck light came on, just once, and turned off in 30 seconds. And for the first time in days I closed my eyes and slept through the night. First thing in the morning, my father roughly roused me by shaking my shoulders. He demanded that I pack up the things I had removed from my bags last night, because we were leaving, now. I never questioned my father, and he seemed almost panicked. So I did as I was told and packed my bags. He didn't talk to me for the entire 7 hours it took us to drive home. I found it very odd. He and I usually took this opportunity to talk about life. It wasn't until after we got home that he told me why he had made us leave so abruptly that morning. He had said that the night light kept turning on and off. He could hear laughter coming from the woods, and sometimes he could have sworn he heard footsteps. The first night it happened, my father woke up first thing in the morning and went to investigate around the cabin, hoping to find a clue as to what had been stalking around outside. He said all he found was a single pine cone, right in front of the door. Surprisingly, there weren't any pine trees immediately around the cabin. So this confused him, but a pine cone is innocent enough, and he kicked it off the porch and forgot it. That was until the next morning. He said that every night except for the night it rained, and the 3 nights it was quiet, he would go out in the morning and find a pine cone exactly where the one had been previously. He would always kick it off to the side of the deck and go on with his day. On the morning that we left, my dad said he had woken up at 6 a.m. because he felt like he had been watched. He looked around in a sleepy daze, and his heart jumped up into his throat when his eyes landed on his own blanket wrapped around him. Placed ever so gently and precisely in the very center of my father's chest was a single pine cone. That trip was the last my father and I ever had. It has been 7 years since this incident, and I still remember the fear it instilled within me. I didn't realize until years later, however, just how lucky I was to have my father there with me. He had heard the laughter and the footsteps, and the night he asked me to switch beds was because he had an uncomfortable feeling eating away at him. He would have rather been the one to sleep in front of the only entrance to the cabin, the only entrance that didn't lock. When I was 14, I would spend the summer holidays away from school at home. In the small village I lived in, this meant I mainly spent my days on my own while my parents worked, watching TV and playing The Sims. My parents were generally out of the house from 8 a.m. until 5 p.m. I was raised to never answer the door to strangers. However, where I liked to sit in the living room, my chair was next to the window anyway, so I could always see people on the street. And they could see me too, I guess. One day I was sat watching daytime TV when I noticed a man walking down our street. As our street is a dead end, I normally recognize everyone who walks down it, but I had certainly never seen him before. He was tall, thin, and unshaven. He was wearing a hooded jumper with the hood up and the sleeves rolled up, revealing tattoos on his arms. He was carrying a large duffel bag and looking closely at each house as he passed. As I sat watching him, I was clearly in full view of him too. He started to pass our house, and when he saw me, he smiled and turned to come up our short drive. He came up to our front door and knocked. I knew I shouldn't answer the door to someone I didn't know, but he had seen me, and at 14, I was afraid of being rude to an adult. So I obediently went and opened the door a crack. I peeked around the door and said hello. As he spoke, he pulled the duffel bag around to the front of his body and asked me if my parents were home. At this point, I thought he would probably leave if I said no. But instead, he stepped towards the door and unzipped the bag. Well, the thing is, I've just got out of prison. I want to do the right thing, you know. It's so hard to find a job, so I'm trying to sell some things. He started pulling towels, handkerchiefs, and other junk out of his bag. The word prison made my heart skip, and I quickly mumbled something about having no money and closed the door. He stood on the step for a minute, still talking to me about being able to help, so I went upstairs and waited for him to leave, which he did. I soon settled back down to watching the TV and forgot all about my encounter. At 5 p.m. my parents came home and they took the TV, so I went up to my room. A little while later there was a knock at the door. I came onto the landing and peered down as my mom answered. 2 police officers were stood on the step. They asked if anyone had called at our house that day. My mom said no one had. And that was when I remembered my visitor from earlier. I came down the stairs and said that, actually, someone had called. Seeing I was young, the 2 police officers asked to come inside and talk to me. They asked me to describe the man and the conversation I had with him. They seemed really worried and kept telling me not to worry and to be honest about what had happened. Once I told them what had happened, they asked to speak to my parents on their own, and then they thanked me and left. I was straight on my parents asking what was going on. My mom explained that a few minutes after the guy had come to her house, he had gone to another girl's house. She was in the shower and hadn't answered the door when he knocked. Apparently, he let himself into the house and walked upstairs when he found her in the shower and sexually assaulted her. With my description and the evidence from the girl, they tracked the guy down. It turned out he had just been released from prison for a similar attack on another girl. I never answer the door when I am alone now. And I also won't shower when I am home alone. I don't usually talk about this, mostly because I don't care to relive what happened that night, and because I've already filed a report, so there's no need to dwell on it. But I've decided to talk about it now, so maybe people will become more aware of walking around at night, especially young girls like myself. It was early April, or maybe it was May. I honestly can't remember. And I had decided to go to my friend's house for the weekend. She had just moved into a trailer park that seemed nice. It was clean and well taken care of. Everybody was friendly and knew each other. Well, almost everybody was friendly. This incident took place around 8:30 p.m., so the sun had been down for a little while. My friend's mother had gone to bed around 7, having to be up for work at 2 a.m. The boy across the narrow road had come to my friend's window and asked if we wanted to hang out. We said yes. I told my friend's mother that we were going outside and would be back soon. I grabbed my phone and put it in my pocket. Where my friend lives, unless you have Verizon, you won't have good service, if any. I, unfortunately, had AT&T, and my friend didn't bring her phone. Neither did the boy. That was mistake number 1. The second mistake was agreeing to leave our yards and go to the park a few streets away. The trailer park is its own little community, with its own playground. We lived about 3-4 streets away. The three of us, ages 13 and 14, walked to the park. I was the oldest, but also the easiest to be scared. My severe, untreated anxiety made the situation worse. As we were walking towards the park, the boy, his name is Colin, said that he saw some people there already. Lisa, the girl I was staying with, said it was fine. Mistake number 3. We kept walking towards the park. At the park, there was a picnic table. That's where we planned on sitting. As we continued walking by, I saw puffs of smoke coming from it. It was obvious the people there were getting high. I knew one of the 3 boys. His name was Kevin. I had met Kevin once before. He had dated Lisa for a short amount of time and then broke up with her. We continued walking past them when Kevin shouted out, "Want to have some fun?" The 3 of us continued walking and turned the corner. Too bad the playground was at the corner, so they could clearly see us. There were woods right next to the road we were on, which scared me quite a bit. Lisa had begun walking backwards, keeping an eye on them. But she turned around to see where she was walking. And that's when the boys would run to catch up to us. Lisa turned around and saw them closer, and ran to the end of the road, waiting at the stop sign for us, but then returning. Colin, the youngest of all of us, told us to keep walking, and that he tried to stop them getting closer. I've never run so fast in my life. I sprinted down the street after I saw what they did to him. I remember him walking to them, and them crowding around him and walking closer to the woods. I figured they were going to take him in there. I ran past Lisa and continued about halfway down that road before I stopped and waited for her. She had asthma, and the last thing we needed was to be separated as well. Apparently Kevin had turned the corner with the other boys and were walking over to us. Lisa screamed at me to run, so once again, I made another mistake and ran off without her, or any form of self-defense. I ran down that road and turned the corner onto our street, and ran about halfway, stopping under the streetlight. I was afraid that one of the boys would be in her yard waiting for me. I heard Lisa shouting my name, so I turned, waiting for her to catch up to me. She told me what had happened to her. Kevin was walking over to me and he took out a knife. I told him to leave me alone and not come any closer, or else I'd kick him in the crotch. He left me alone after that. The 2 of us walked to her house. We had no idea where Colin was. When we got to her driveway, we saw the 3 boys come to us through her yard. They had obviously cut through people's lawns to get there so quickly. Lisa had said, "Get off my fucking lawn before I call the cops." I was on the phone with my long-distance boyfriend. Kevin replied with, "What did I do?" To which she said, "You know what you did." I remember looking up and seeing one of the boys looking me up and down. He also said, "Hey, what you doing?" I rolled my eyes and walked inside. The two of us were shaking and in tears. We still didn't know where Colin was. I sat in my friend's room and looked out the window, seeing someone walking down the road. I thought it was Kevin, but it wasn't. Luckily, it was Colin. This is what he told me. I walked over to them, and they all huddled around me. One of them held me while Kevin put his arm around my neck and put a knife up to my face, saying, "What are you gonna do?" I kind of zoned out for a minute. Then he pulled out a pocket knife. Colin said, he gave me the knife and said he didn't want to get caught with it. It was dangerous for him to be outside alone, so he went back to his house, and Lisa and I spent the rest of our night making sure the windows and doors were shut and locked. It was so stupid of me not to call the police. But 1, I didn't know where I was. 2, I didn't remember that they could track my phone, and 3, I didn't have any service until I got back to the house. By then, I didn't know where the boys went, and I also didn't know her address or think that the police could track my phone. All I have to say is just be careful when you're walking around at night. The situation could have been a lot worse, and you can't trust anybody. Several years ago, I worked at a job in Texas, where most evenings I was home at a normal time. But about once per week, I would get home anywhere between 9 p.m. and 1 a.m., depending on deadlines. I lived in an area that wasn't super nice, but it wasn't known for being particularly dangerous either. It was a neighborhood full of apartment complexes that is still a very popular area for young, single people to live, so there are always people coming and going at all hours, but everyone was always very nice and friendly. I was in my early 20s, and a bit naive at the time, but I had watched enough true crime television to know a few rules about being a single gal in the city, and how to react in a potentially dangerous situation. Up until a certain point, though. It was all just warnings and cautionary tales. One night, after an especially long day and a chaotic race to meet some hard deadlines, I arrived home way later than usual. Since it was so late, all the good parking spots were taken. But I parked my car as close to my building as I could, under a street lamp, just like my dad taught me. I held my bag close to my body, and I started walking toward my apartment, with my head up and my eyes peeled. I learned in a self-defense class that predators look for weak targets who aren't paying attention to their surroundings. As I was walking toward my apartment, I noticed a guy walking toward me from the opposite end of the sidewalk. I'd never seen him before, which was odd. This meant he was either a guest of one of my neighbors, or he was new, or he was trouble. There are parts of this encounter that I remember so vividly, I will never forget what this guy was wearing. He had on black denim pants and a solid black long-sleeve shirt in the middle of the summer, in Texas. I also remember that he was completely bald, very pale, and even though his style reminded me a lot of my art school friends, something about him gave me an unshakably creepy feeling. It was a T-shaped sidewalk we were walking on, so if we continued to walk toward each other at the same pace, we would eventually meet at the intersection of the sidewalk at the same time, where I would turn right, his left, to go between the buildings and toward my apartment door. And to my left, his right, would be the parking lot. Since I was still close enough to my car that I could get back to it quickly if I needed to, I slowed my pace just a bit, to make it so he was ahead of me, so I could see what he would do. Would he go ahead of me and turn left to go between the buildings toward an apartment? Or turn right and go into the parking lot and leave? I kept my eyes on him the whole time. I had read in 17 magazine or somewhere that if you make eye contact with a potential attacker, they are less likely to go through with their attack because they know you have seen their face and can identify them in a lineup. Just as he was getting to the intersection of the sidewalk, a few steps ahead of me, he stopped and took a step off the curb to his right onto the parking lot surface. And, with his left foot still on the curb, he leaned in between two cars and looked into one of the windows. This pause closed the gap between us that I had created by slowing my pace. Just as I was starting to round the corner to head toward my apartment, he quickly turned his head toward me like a robot, zeroing in on his next target, and we locked eyes. He didn't smile, or raise a hand to wave or greet me in any way like a neighbor would. His face remained expressionless, almost stern. My blood ran cold. As I continued turning the corner, I held eye contact with him as long as possible, and he didn't look away from me either. At this point, I had nowhere to run. I could only continue forward and hope to make it to my apartment safely, because he was now in between me and the path to my car or any other exit. Just as I was about to break eye contact with him to look where I was going, I saw his right foot leave the parking lot, and he shifted his weight back onto the sidewalk and started following me. It was very obvious that he had only stopped there so that I would walk ahead of him. This is the part where I lose any and all memory of what happened. I don't know if I teleported, or was carried by angels, or if I was just so terrified by the look on his face and his sudden change of direction that I blacked out for a little bit while I sprinted like hell. 1 second I was turning the corner to walk away from him, and the next, I'm inside my apartment, scrambling to lock the deadbolts as fast as humanly possible. Once the deadbolts were locked, I plastered my face up against the door to look out of the peephole to see if he was out there. I saw nothing. No one. He wasn't walking up and down the sidewalk, and he wasn't lurking in the corridor where my apartment door and several others were located. My roommate must have heard me slam the door and throw my things down and fiddle with the locks, because she came out of her room and down the hall to the front door to find out what the hell was going on. It was obvious that I woke her up from a deep sleep. On a weeknight, no less. I felt terrible for waking her up, and I tried to explain to her what had just happened. But I had no idea how to explain it. Even right then, in the moment right after it happened, I had zero recollection of how I made it from the edge of the parking lot to inside our apartment 30 feet away. It was, and still is, so strange to try to figure out. I've been racking my brain ever since, trying to remember what happened in those few seconds, but it's just gone. Did I experience some sort of miracle that night? I don't know. What I do know is that if I had not been so aware of my surroundings, had I not been so bold as to look him in the eye, this story could have ended in a very different way. Others have not been so lucky. So stay safe out there, ladies and gents. Walk strongly, walk with confidence, keep your head up, and pay attention to your surroundings, not your phone. This story happened last summer when I was still in college and living in an apartment. I had 2 other roommates who lived with me. My one roommate, Ali, was originally from a city about 45 minutes from our school, so she went home a lot on weekends. My other roommate, Kate, and I were both from out of state, so we never really went home. So summer rolls around, and Ali accepted an internship in her hometown and left for the summer. So it was just me and Kate. We both had internships in town and worked 40 hours a week, so we didn't really see each other except on weekends. My apartment complex was large and had an open layout, so everyone's front doors were accessible from outside. You didn't have to be buzzed in or anything. We lived on the first floor. We also had a lot of friends who lived in our same complex. We would often leave our doors unlocked during the day when we were home in case anyone popped in to say hi. It was a Friday, which meant I didn't have to go into work until noon. All the executives had meetings in the morning, and since I was an intern, I wasn't required to be there. Kate, however, still left at her usual time of 8:30, leaving the door unlocked. Nothing uncommon about that. She knew I would be up soon, plus it was 8:30 a.m. What could happen? I was getting ready for work in my bathroom, with the door closed around 10 a.m., when I heard our front door swing open. I figured it must have been one of my friends, wanting to borrow something, or Kate had left her lunch here. I waited a minute for my friend to yell my name or raid my fridge, but I didn't hear anything. I suddenly got a very uneasy feeling. I stuck my head out and didn't see anything initially. Then I stepped out and turned towards the kitchen. Standing in my kitchen was a middle-aged man with his back to me. "Excuse me, can I help you?" I yelled. The man turned around, looking very surprised to see me. He was holding a grocery bag with something in it. I couldn't see what it was. He stared at me for about 5 seconds before telling me he was maintenance, and we had called about an issue with our sink. I immediately felt like an idiot for being so rude, and thought Kate had put in a request and not told me. She had done this before. He then mumbled something along the lines of, he didn't have the proper tools to fix the problem, so he would have to come back later. He then breezed past me and went out the door. Weird. I immediately texted Kate and bitched at her for not telling me he was coming. She didn't respond, so I continued getting ready for work and left. Around 2 p.m., Kate called me on her break to explain she never put in a maintenance request. I immediately got a nervous feeling. She told me to call our manager's office and report it. I told my manager the story, and he was not exactly very concerned and just blew me off. My apartment complex was pretty safe. The only time I ever saw a police car was to bust some idiots throwing beer bottles off their balcony. The next day, I continued to rationalize to myself that the guy had been maintenance and he was just confused. By the weekend, I had basically forgotten about it. Kate left Friday night for the weekend, meaning I had the apartment to myself, which never happens, so I was pumped. This was around the time of the NBA playoffs, and our hometown team was playing Saturday night, so me and a few of my friends went to a bar to watch the game. We left around 8 and decided to call tonight around 2 a.m. My friends were taking an Uber, but were headed in a different direction than me, so I opted to walk. Taking the long way meant I was coming from the opposite direction of where I usually walked in from the parking lot. I could see my windows first from the street, then have to walk around, up a few steps, to get to my front door. As I got closer to my apartment, I could tell something was off with the windows. I could see Ali's window was just barely cracked open. First of all, Ali has been gone since May, and it was the end of June. Then as I got even closer, I saw the screen looked funny. It was sideways, like it had been popped out and then been put back in upside down. Now listen, I'm not one to overreact, but I knew for a fact that window had been closed before I left for the bar. So I noped the fuck out of there and ran to my friend's apartment on the 3rd floor, where I called the police. I went down when they got there and reiterated the situation to them. They told me to go back to my friend's apartment and wait until they told me it was okay to come out. After about 2 minutes, the cop walked out with, you guessed it, the fucking weirdo who was in my kitchen the day before. The cop was holding this big-ass hunting knife in his hand. Nope. I really wish the police hadn't told me what I'm about to write, because it still haunts me. They found the creep hiding behind my couch in the living room, holding a hunting knife wrapped in a Kroger bag. Even creepier, had I not walked home and noticed the messed up window, I would have just walked in the front door from the parking lot unknowingly. I had a lot to drink that night, and I just planned on going right into my room and passing out. I would have fallen asleep with this guy still in my apartment. I know for a fact he wasn't just planning on hanging out. So, weirdo non-maintenance guy, let's not meet. I work in a department store and I've had to deal with drunk customers before, staggering around the store and even trying to start pillow fights with me. But there was this one guy who terrified me. I'll start this by describing myself. I'm around 5'11", and kinda chubby, but by no means fat. I'm a little big and not easily intimidated by most people. My hair is red, but my bangs and 2 streaks of my hair are a green-teal color. On this day in particular, I wasn't wearing a full face of makeup. Honestly, I think all I had time to do was some eyeliner, and I've got the unfortunate baby face. So this guy, I'd say around 6'2", walks up to me and asks if I can help him. He's got a slight accent, but I can't even place it. Kinda like an English accent, but it was just off. He's got greyish-white hair and a goatee. I'm not great with age guessing, but he was at least old enough to be my dad, if not my grandpa. He's also what I describe as husky. A little fat, but overall just generally big, at least twice my size. He's also wearing a thick coat, but it was an unseasonably warm and sunny day, without a cloud in sight. He starts asking me about men's clothing, but he's talking under his breath, so it's hard to hear. So I lean in to hear him better. I think he's just asking where that department is, so I proceed to point him in the direction of the men's department. Then I hear him mumble something else, this time about young men sounding displeased. I ask, "Oh, if you're looking for young men's, that's in the front corner of them." He cut me off mid-sentence, and his whole demeanor changed. He raised his voice. "What? Do I look like a young man to you? What are you, like 15? Then I watch as his eyes scan me up and down, almost as though he were checking me out. As if that outburst hadn't even happened, he calmly starts mumbling again, and I can't quite make out what he's saying. All I hear is that he's talking about my hair. It was like he was thinking out loud but didn't realize it. Then, he clearly says he has to use the restroom, but once he's done, he wants me to help him find a dress shirt, and that he wants it to match my hair. I politely say, okay, and give him a fake laugh and smile, not knowing what else to do. As soon as he turns to walk away, I bolt to the other end of the store. I was panicking already because that encounter was just uncomfortable. So I'm trying to avoid him when a couple ask me for help. So I'm helping this couple, and they, of course, drag me back down to the end of the store where this guy is still waiting. In that time, one of my co-workers had the pleasure of talking to him for a moment, but he told her he didn't need any help. He was just standing there. So I'm helping the couple still, and I walk past him and he kinda shouts at me in an angry tone. It was quiet enough, but also too loud to be mistaken for a normal indoor voice. He said something along the lines of why was I ignoring him even though I had agreed to help him. That's when I really noticed his size and the way he shifted his body as he took a step towards me. I felt like he was threatening me and knew if he lunged, I wouldn't stand a chance. I tell him I wasn't ignoring him and that I was just helping someone else. I hand off the item the couple was looking for and direct my attention to him as he's waiting less than 5 feet behind me. I honestly didn't know what else to do. My body screamed run, but my head said if you do, something bad is going to happen. He told me he had already looked at shirts and didn't find what he wanted. So then he asks if I will walk him to the front doors. Alarm bells are sounding in my head. Don't want to go too close to the doors with this guy because who knows if he will grab me and drag me out into a waiting car or something. My heart was racing, but then I thought, my manager is in the front of the store at the jewelry counter, and if I walk the guy to there, I'll still be safe. He will be able to see the exit from there, but he won't be close enough to be able to kidnap me easily. So I walk up with him, and we're walking next to the bras and the aisles are kinda small. I realize he keeps trying to walk next to me, but the aisles are way too small for him to walk next to me without us touching. So we're weaving in and out of the fixtures in the center aisle, me trying to avoid him, and him trying to stand next to me. And then he starts to laugh. He mumbles some more. Something about, it's funny that we're weaving in and out of the brassiers. I'm thinking this is not funny at all. He proceeds to ask me why I dyed my hair. I look at him and say, I don't know, because I felt like it, I guess. Then he asks me how old I think he is. I reply with, and I don't know. Then he asks me again about 5 seconds later. I repeat, I don't know. He doesn't even tell me how old he is, and he tries to ask personal questions. He asks my middle name. I pause. The look he gave me was of pure frustration, so I gave him my middle name. I wish I could say I used a different name, but I didn't. I panicked, but I sure as hell wasn't giving this guy my last name. My middle name is pretty common anyways. He repeated my first and middle name back. He knew my first name because of my tag. I shuddered. My mom says it when she's mad, but him saying it actually scared me worse. We finally reached the front of the store. He asked me to take off my glasses. I slipped them down for a second, not even uncovering my eyes, and pushed them back up real quick. Honestly, I wasn't sure what to do. My training never covered this sort of a situation. I was terrified of what he might do should I refuse him. My instinct was telling me to oblige, so long as what he asked was somewhat harmless. After I did that, he says, "Oh yes, your eyes are beautiful, as I thought they'd be." I'm confused. Is he hitting on me? Didn't he just say I looked 15? What the fuck? We get to the front of the store, and he then asks me if I know why he wanted me to walk him to the front. I honestly tell him I don't know. He starts giggling to himself like a schoolgirl. If you've never heard a grown man giggle, let me just tell you, it's unsettling. He says, "Oh, you probably just think I'm a crazy old man." In my head, I'm screaming, "Yes, now get the fuck away from me." But I feel if I actually say yes, he is going to hurt me. He then says, "I wanted you to walk me to the front because I wanted to spend a little more time with you." I'm standing there like I don't even know this guy. This guy doesn't even know me. Why does he want to spend more time with me? I want to get away from him. My manager walks by and I shoot her the most horrified look, and she just smiles and waves, completely oblivious. Then he follows that up with, "Sometimes the Lord just brings people together." Not us, nope, fuck that. He reaches into his jacket and grabs hold of something. Then he quickly adds, "And sometimes he takes them away." He still had a hold of whatever is in his jacket. My heart sinks and I'm thinking, this is it. He's got a knife or a gun. He's going to murder me in this store right now. He's going to murder me and drag my body out and stuff it in his trunk. He follows that up with another, "You probably just think I'm a crazy old man." I pause to think on that, and I respond with a seemingly thought out, "No, not really." And then he lets go of whatever he had a hold of in his coat, and draws his hand back out. He looks at me intently, then after several seconds of awkward staring says, "And now I'm going to leave, and probably never see you again." I'm like, thank fucking God. He turns to leave, but whips his head back around. "But if I do happen to come back," his voice deepened, "don't call security on me." As soon as he turned around to walk out the door, I ran to the loss prevention office to hide. Loss prevention is the closest thing we have to security. My legs felt like jello, but I kept moving as if my life depended on it. I was then escorted to the back of the store to wait until they could confirm that he was indeed gone from the store. I waited for about a half hour before I went back out to finish my shift. When my shift ended, I waited around for a half hour more, so I would be able to walk out with someone else. The woman I walked out with had also encountered him by the register while I was hiding on the other end of the store. She proceeded to tell me that she thinks he was drunk. I'm still currently working at that same place, and I haven't seen him since. I hope we never meet again. So this happened when I was 15 years old. I was a really wild child, and one random Friday or Saturday night, my friend Josie had come over to my house. We had spent most of the afternoon in my front yard doing gymnastics and shit, and while we were cartwheeling through the grass, this old rusty pickup drove past, slowing down as he got closer, the man in the truck turning to stare as he rolled by. Seriously, I remember watching it because people normally fly down the rural road I live on, not slow down. We joked that the man, a guy with a baseball cap on his face, was hidden by the shadow of it, save for a very long and scraggly grey beard, was obviously checking out our pubescent bodies, and quickly forgot about it. Later that night, we had made plans to sneak out of my house to see Josie's boyfriend. It was super easy to do. My dad's bedroom was on the opposite side of the house, so he wouldn't hear us. And my bedroom window was really tall, and only about 3 to 4 feet off the ground. along with the fact that it had no screen, so sneaking out was easy as walking out the back door. We had gotten outside, and we were walking around the front of my house to sit on the porch and wait for Josie's boyfriend to get us, when I noticed something in the cornfield across from my house. It looked like a rusty pickup truck, the windshield glinting slightly in the moonlight, and the tiny light of what could have been a cell phone or camera lighting up the interior of the car, a scraggly beard barely visible in the glow. Immediately my heart just sunk. It was most definitely the truck that had driven past us earlier, and it was sitting in the field facing my house. I nudged Josie and pointed it out to her, and we both pretended not to notice it. Maybe he was a farmer, we decided after a minute, or a guy getting ready to go hunting. We smoked a cigarette while we waited and continued ignoring the truck, despite the fact that I could almost feel him staring. I had been keeping my eyes on the road, watching for Trent, when we both heard this horrible groaning sound coming from the field. The guy in the truck was opening his very creaky, squeaky door, climbing out of his truck. "Let's just wait inside," I said as the man started walking towards the road towards us, his hands behind his back. Josie quickly agreed, and we made a mad dash back around my house. And I could hear the man starting to pick up the pace behind us, his shoes now crunching on the gravel road. Luckily, I had left my bedroom window open, so we bolted through it, and I slammed it shut, locking it just as a shadowy figure appeared at the glass. I closed the curtains and Josie turned off my light, and we sat huddled in the dark as she texted her boyfriend what was going on. As we sat there, we heard him tap on the glass, scratchy noises like he was running his fingernails up and down. We both started crying, debating whether to call 911 or not. I didn't want to wake my dad up since Trent had called us in the meantime, saying he was only a minute away and would handle it. Burly redneck boys for the win. And Dad would kill us if he had gone outside to find an intruder, only to have a random boy we invited over to join the ass-kicking. Afterwards seemed like forever. The sounds of tapping ahead turned into desperate scraping, as though he was trying to get his fingers under the wooden windowsill. Then headlights. Trent, who had snuck over to my house many a time before, had driven into my yard, his headlights lighting up my yard, and the man standing at the window. There was no more scraping, and Trent's massive truck backed out the yard a second later. He called us to let us know that the guy had just bolted to his truck, which was confirmed as we heard the screeching of tires on the road a second later. And Josie and I cried with relief. At that point, I was too afraid to leave my house, so I let Josie out with her heroic bow. She froze when she climbed out the window, hands shaking as she reached down for something I couldn't see, her blonde hair hiding her hands. "Holy shit," she whispered, holding something up for me to see. A fucking huge hunting knife, the tip bent slightly. At the bottom of my windowsill were deep gouge marks where he'd been trying to pry the window open. She climbed back inside, and Trent joined us, the three of us taking turns staying up till it was nearly daylight and Trent had to leave. We never heard from or saw Mr. Scragglybeard again, and I moved a couple years later, so the odds are we will never meet again.